The letters arrived out of nowhere, taunting the police and the media, signed with a name that would become etched in fear: BTK, bind, torture, kill. In those cold, calculated words, the author made one thing clear. There was a killer hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting, and relishing in the attention. For over 3 decades, the people of Wichita, Kansas lived alongside a man who seemed to blend into their everyday lives. He was a husband, a father, a Cub Scout leader, and even a dedicated member of the local church's council. He was the president even. But Dennis Rader wasn't just any man. He was a predator. Okay, that was my dramatic intro for this video. I want to talk about the BTK Killer, Dennis Rader. He's one of the most interesting killers in my opinion. He's so just interesting to learn about. I mean, from the title, you can tell that he evaded capture for 30 years, over 30 years, which is insane for a serial killer. Today, I want to uncover his twisted mind and talk about it because it's something that I really find interesting. And I hope you guys might find it interesting too. So sit back, relax, get a snack, get something, and let's get straight into this video. To really understand how Dennis Rader became the BTK Killer, we have to start in his childhood. He was born in 1945 in a small town in Kansas with 4 brothers. His parents, William and Dorothea Rader, were typical working-class white people. His dad was a Marine during World War II, and then he worked for the electric utility company, while his mom worked at a grocery store. On the surface, it was just an all-American, normal, standard Kansas family, and Dennis's childhood seemed pretty ordinary. But obviously, it wasn't really. It appeared ordinary on most fronts, but as with a lot of serial killers and people who become killers, there's a lot of early signs in the childhood, and Dennis Rader's are really interesting. Rader himself later admitted that by the time he was a young boy, he was already experiencing, I don't know if my editor should blur this, but violent sex fantasies. These fantasies center around power and control, often involving tying women up and torturing them. And the interesting thing is, from the interviews that we had from him, we learned that these weren't just like a, once a week or once a month kind of thing that were just like kind of, out of the ordinary, like weird, because we all get like intrusive thoughts, I guess. But this was something that he fixated on constantly as a child. Now, a lot of this he just kept to himself. Like his family and friends didn't really know anything was going on. He just seemed normal. It's all in his head, and he didn't vocalize it or make it known. Although he did act on a little bit of his urges in small ways that were private for the most part. So for example, with a lot of serial killers too, he would torture animals, mostly small creatures like cats and dogs. And again, this is something that we see in a lot of serial killers, like Ted Bundy did it, Jeffrey Dahmer did it. It's one of the earliest signs that a mind could become or be deviated. Mostly because it shows that they can inflict pain and like watch the animal suffer without showing any empathy for what they're doing. Because if somebody does it once, like a kid like throws a rock at an animal once, and then they're going to see that the animal's hurt, they're going to like feel bad for it. But that's an early sign, is that if they do that, they don't feel bad and they continue doing it and then torturing the animal in like worse and worse ways. But here's the thing, Dennis Rader was smart. Even as a kid, he knew how to hide his dark side. Like I said, it was pretty private that he was even doing this to animals. He didn't get into trouble at school. He wasn't the kind of kid who stood out as a bully or a troublemaker. He was quiet, he kept to himself, and he flew under the radar, kind of just like, I don't know, a nerd or an outcast or something like that. And that's something that would help him out later in his career. Can I call it that? His deviated career. Rader learned how to blend in with normal society, how to like wear a mask of normalcy that would allow him to get away with his crimes without anybody knowing that he was a freak. Dennis Rader was freaky. However, behind that mask, Rader was dealing with a lot of feelings of inadequacy, which we see in a lot of serial killers. Throughout his life, he felt really powerless, like he didn't have any control over his life or his destiny or where he would end up. And we see this later, especially with school, because he dropped out of college. He served in the Air Force and tried a bunch of other things to try to find some kind of meaning or purpose in his life, but nothing worked, and he still felt like he was missing something in his life that made him worthwhile or gave his life meaning. But here's where it gets interesting, because while Rader couldn't control his life or where he was going to end up or anything like that, one thing he could control were his fantasies. He basically created an entire world in his head where he did have power, because he wanted that power so bad. He craved it. He created a world specifically where he could dominate and control his victims, mostly women. And again, that need for power, especially over women, is what led him to kill later on. And what's interesting is that when we think about serial killers and murderers and stuff, we kind of think that they really enjoy like the killing, you know, like we kind of have like a Hollywood horror movie idea of it. But what's interesting is that when we learn the psychology of these killers and like his interviews and stuff, it wasn't even really about the killing as much as like he felt thrill from planning out the murder, planning it out, thinking about it, having the control in his mind, and just having a plan that he had complete control over, especially over a human. That's what made it sexual and even more exciting to him, which is messed up. Basically, we learned specifically that for Rader, the thrill came from knowing that he was in control of whether or not his victim would die or not. By the time that Rader was in his 20s, he was ready to take the next step. His fantasies just weren't enough anymore. He wanted to act on them, but he was smart and he didn't rush into anything. One of the most chilling things about Rader is how slow and smart and methodical he was. He wasn't a reckless killer who just lashed out in the heat of the moment. He spent time studying his victims, learning their routines, and figuring out how to catch them off guard. And what's kind of, I mean, to me this is like really scary, is that in interviews we learned that he referred to these plans as projects. Each victim was part of a specific project he was working on. That's the word he used, which is creepy. By the early 1970s, Dennis Rader was living in Wichita, Kansas with his wife, Paula, and he was working an ordinary job. To everyone around him, he seemed like an average guy, just a quiet man who kept to himself. And like I said, he was involved in the church. He was the president of the council at his church. He had 2 kids, and he seemed to be building just a regular, normal class life. But behind the scenes, Rader's fantasies were getting stronger and stronger. He had already started stalking women, picking out potential victims, and crafting the perfect plan. And then these fantasies became real in January of 1974. The Otero family was the first to fall victim to Rader's messed up plans. The family, Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their children Josephine and Joseph Jr., lived in a modest home in a quiet Wichita neighborhood. They had no idea that Dennis Rader had been stalking them, watching them, finding out their routines and stuff. And then on the morning of January 15th, 1974, Rader made his move. He broke into the house, he cut the phone lines to ensure that no one could call for help. It was a cold and calculated decision, just showing how smart he was even from the beginning, that he knew to like cut the lines on the phones. He planned it all out. And again, doing that showed that he was in control. He was exerting more control over these people. What makes Rader's first crime so disturbing is the level of both brutality but also precision that he exhibited. He didn't just break in and kill the family quickly and get his hands dirty. He took his time. So first, he rounded up all 4 members of the family, binding them with ropes. His method was straightforward. Bind, torture, kill. That's where his nickname BTK comes from. But to Rader, again, it wasn't about the actual act of tying these people up. It was about the control he was pushing over them. He killed Joseph and Julie Otero first, suffocating them with plastic bags and like tying the cord around their neck. Now, he also did the same thing to 9-year-old Joseph Jr., but he saved an even more, the most disturbing part for last. He took 11-year-old Josephine into the basement where he hung her from a pipe and watched her die. Josephine's death was especially important to Rader because she represented everything that he craved from his victims: vulnerability, control, and domination. In his mind, he was orchestrating the perfect murder, and his real target was Josephine. And what's also interesting is that when he went into that home, he didn't expect the parents to be home. He didn't expect there to be, because Joseph Otero, like the father of the family, was a military man. He was strong, he was retired. He didn't expect that, but he didn't run away or flee. He was so smart and methodical. He took his time and then still did it, getting away. After the Otero murders, Rader didn't panic or flee. Instead, he calmly collected some items from around the house. Personal items that would serve as trophies to remind him of this conquest of control. And then he just walked out of their home like a normal guy, pretending like nothing even happened. When the bodies of the Otero family were discovered later that day, it shocked the entire community. No one could comprehend why such a brutal crime had taken place in their quiet little Wichita town. But for Dennis Rader, it was just the beginning. Now, this kind of touches on what I was saying earlier, but what's really chilling about Rader in particular is how he was able to compartmentalize his crimes, unlike really any other serial killer. You'd think that after committing a crime like that, you'd be suffering from guilt, you know, they would break down or show some kind of outward sign of like what they did, but no. Rader just went back to his normal life, his job, his place on the church committee council, his wife, everything. Like, it was just normal. It was as if the Otero murders were just another project of his, unlike anything else in his same mundane life. He didn't even show any sign afterward. It's insane. For the next several years, Rader continued to stalk and kill his victims, each time following the exact same method that his name was named after: BTK, bind, torture, kill. But to Rader, the Otero murders were really special because it showed what he was capable of. He didn't know what he was capable of. It's always been just fantasies in his head, and he probably knew to an extent that he might not be as good at it as he actually thought he was. But the Otero murders showed him how smart he was and how capable he was at this, so that kind of like set the mark for it. The police, of course, were desperate to find who committed the Otero murders, but Rader had left almost no clues behind. He was careful, he was methodical, he enjoyed knowing that the police had no idea what was happening. They had no idea. And that feeling of superiority over the police is what kept him to keep going, because again, it's not just about the killings, it's about how he felt he had control over a whole situation. He had control over these people, over the police, over the media coverage, everything. That's what he was craving, was that control. Now, because of that control, he loved having that control over the community, but eventually it wasn't enough. Soon he just wanted more and more attention. And by October of 1974, Rader decided it was time to make his presence known in doing something that probably made him famous for what he's famous for today. He sent an anonymous letter to a local newspaper describing the Otero murders in graphic detail, things that only the police would know or the killer. This letter was his way of showing the world what he was capable of and what he had done without giving away his identity. And in the letter he wrote, "Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity. The code words from me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." End quote. This was the first time that the world would hear the words BTK, and it was a name that would haunt Wichita for decades. The arrogance in Rader's letter was honestly surprising because, like, think about it, the police had these 3 people in custody who they thought did the murders, but he sent them a letter saying, like, that's wrong, like, you got the wrong people. Like, I mean, you would think that you would want someone else to take the blame for it, but no, like, what he was after was that control. What's important to understand about Rader is that his need for control and his need for attention went hand in hand. It wasn't enough for him to simply commit these murders and keep it to himself in his head. He wanted credit. He needed that attention. He wanted to play a game with the police to see how long he could taunt them without getting caught. And for years, that's exactly what he did. After the Otero murders, Rader continued to stalk and kill. His next known victim was Katheryn Bright, a 21-year-old woman that he had been watching for weeks. On April 4th, 1974, Rader broke into her home, tied her up, and tortured her before stabbing her to death. Rader's MO, his modus operandi, was consistent. He would stalk his victims, learn the routines, and attack them when they were most vulnerable. But each murder brought him a little bit closer to the edge, a little bit more reckless, and we're going to talk about that. So over the next few years, Rader killed Shirley Vian in 1977 and Nancy Fox later that same year. Each time he followed the exact same pattern: bind, torture, kill. But with each murder, Rader's desire for recognition only grew stronger. In December of 1977, after killing Nancy Fox, Rader sent another letter, but this time directly to the police department. This letter began with the chilling words, quote, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" In this letter, Rader outlined his previous murders and even hinted at some possible more ones. It was almost as if he was daring the police to catch him, but at the same time, he was feeding off of the fact that they couldn't. This was all part of a game for them. He loved the newspapers and the news outlets trying to piece together who he was, trying to piece together who the BTK Strangler could be. Rader's ego just kept growing and growing bigger and bigger with every single letter he sent, but it was to his downfall because so was his recklessness. What's fascinating and terrifying about these letters is that it gives us a really deep, outlook into his psyche. He saw himself as superior and untouchable, and like I said earlier, to him these murders were his projects, and these letters were his way of showcasing the projects publicly and getting recognition for them. Each letter was carefully crafted to let everybody know that he was still in control, he was still out there, and they couldn't do anything about it. For the next few years, BTK would go quiet, but the damage had already been done. Rader had planted himself into the minds of the people and the justice system of Wichita, Kansas. He didn't need to kill constantly to keep that fear intact. Just the thought and the knowledge that he was still out there uncaught was enough for him to feed off of that control. But Dennis Rader wasn't finished, not by a long shot. He had so much more in store for Wichita, and eventually that became his own undoing. By the late 1970s, Rader was still living with his wife and living like a perfect American life. He worked 2 jobs. He worked as a compliance officer in the small city of Park City, and as a home security company consultant. Now, as the compliance officer in Park City, he was responsible for enforcing local ordinances like lawn regulations and animal control, which this might just be nitpicking, but it kind of just shows how his need for control was, that even in his job, he relished in, making sure that people's lawns were the right length and stuff like that. It's just, I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy, I don't know. But I mean, his normal life was so normal that if you lived next to him, you wouldn't think twice about this random, normal, outcast guy, and that's exactly what he wanted. Rader was a master at blending in. He had spent his entire life learning and trying to learn better how to present himself as just another normal guy. But behind closed doors, he was living still in his fantasy world. He spent hours writing detailed journals about his crimes, documenting every single little detailed step of the murders in graphic detail. He even collected souvenirs from the victims like we were talking about, items like underwear or personal possessions that he would later use to relive the experiences in his head. Now, what's also particularly haunting about Rader is that his jobs, a lot of them allowed him better access into people's homes. So he worked for the home security company ADT, where he would install alarm systems in people's homes, which would give him, the opportunity to study their habits and their layout, going into these homes, even understanding their security, knowing their security better to get in there better. But despite all this careful planning, Rader wasn't invincible. After his final confirmed victim, Dolores Davis, he went quiet in 1991. And it's not entirely clear why he took a big break from killing. He just quit killing after that. Some people think it's because he got older and he wanted to actually focus on having a regular family life and that kind of thing. Others think that he was just so confident that at this point, just relishing in the old murders he had done was enough for him because he was confident he wouldn't get caught. Whatever the reason though, his murders stopped for over a decade. Now, what's important to think about is how even though he stopped killing, his desire for attention and control still was there, and that is what eventually led to his downfall. By the mid-1990s, Dennis Rader pretty much completely vanished from the public eye. The murders had stopped, and the fear that grasped Wichita during the 70s and 80s was completely gone. BTK became a cold case with no new leads, and the police had little hope of solving it. So pretty much he was too good at getting away with it for his own good, because then he started to miss the control and the fear. Rader's ego was massive. He had gotten away with 10 murders, and for more than a decade, no one had gotten even close to catching him for them. He believed that he was smarter than the police, smarter than the FBI, smarter than everybody, and this is what led to his undoing. In 2004, Rader decided it was time to bring BTK back into the spotlight. He couldn't resist the urge to toy and play with the police even more to remind them that he was still out there, still smarter than they were. So he sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle, a local newspaper, claiming responsibility for a murder that he had committed back in 1986, the killing of Vicky Wiegler. In the letter, this is crazy, Rader included photographs of Wiegler's body and a copy of her missing driver's license. The letter was his way of telling the world, I'm still here. The police, of course, were shocked. They thought that BTK was gone, maybe even dead, but the letter proved that the killer was still alive and out there. Over the next several months, he didn't stop. He kept sending more packages and letters containing more disturbing and sick items, like a doll bound in the same way that he bound his victims. In one package, he sent a word puzzle that included clues about his identity, almost as if he wanted to be caught, like he was tired of not getting caught. But in reality, Rader's need for control was still at the forefront. He wanted to show that even though the police were investigating him again, he was still in control. He was in the lead here. That's what he wanted everybody to know. Now, Rader's downfall is really interesting because it wasn't from any slip up in his murders. He was one of the most skilled murderers ever. It came from his own arrogance. He asked, in one of the letters to the police, he asked the police if they could trace a floppy disk back to him if he sent them one. The police, of course, said no, knowing full well that they could, but Rader, trusting his own brilliance, sent the disk. The floppy disk ended up becoming his undoing. The police quickly traced it to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, where Rader was the president of the council. It didn't take long to connect that computer to him, and then, obviously, they got him. At the same time, DNA evidence from Rader's daughter was matched with DNA found at one of the crime scenes, further confirming that he was BTK. On February 25th, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. When the police confronted him, immediately he knew why they were there. And then what's almost funny is that in classic Rader fashion, he tried to maintain control by asking the detectives How many people do you think I killed? As if it was still all just a game to him. Now, in his confession, Rader spoke about how his killings were nothing more than projects to him. He showed little remorse for what he did. He detailed every murder in like a calm, matter-of-fact manner, which is really cold to watch, like just talking matter-of-factly about these awful murders. Rader's trial was a media sensation. In court, he pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder, and his confession was bone-chilling. He detailed each crime, walking the court through how he bound, tortured, and killed each one of his victims. For Rader, it was almost like he was revisiting and reminiscing on his glory days. It's sick. He showed no remorse, only a clinical fascination for what he did. In August of 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He was spared the death penalty because Kansas didn't have it at that point, which is kind of unfortunate. Maybe, I don't know. Today, Rader sits in solitary confinement at El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he's gonna spend the rest of his life. Even in prison, Rader's need for control hasn't subsided. He continues to correspond with people outside, talking with criminologists and journalists as if he still wants to be remembered. He still wants to control how his story is remembered and told. The legacy of Dennis Rader is a dark one. His ability to lead a double life so long without raising any suspicion is kind of scary, because how many other people are doing that right now? He wasn't a drifter, he wasn't someone that fit the profile of a normal serial killer. He was a neighbor, a coworker, and a friend. And that's what makes it so terrifying. How many people do you know that now could be a serial killer? Thank you guys for watching. This video was so much fun to make. I'm really interested in this stuff, so I hope you guys enjoy hearing me talk about it. I had so much fun. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. Let me know what you want to see more. I don't know. I'm trying this new kind of content style. Let me know what you think. I had fun. I hope you all have a great day, a great night, whatever. Sweet dreams.